All right, Trent, it's great to see you, man. It's been a while, about 5 years since we met in person last. And then got to tell you a quick story. Last night, I was at dinner with a bunch of retirees from my neighborhood. We do it about once a month. The retired Marine Corps officer next to me, starts talking about the parallels between what's happening now in AI and what happened in the 30s and 40s with the introduction of radar and the capabilities we had at fighting at night with the U.S. Navy. You brought up your book.
Nice.
Yeah, really cool, small world. But I want to get your thoughts on this. What can people take away from your earlier book, Learning War, and its parallels, if any, to what's happening now today with AI?
Oh, I think quite a bit, because one of the things that I stress in that book that the U.S. Navy was good at doing was exploring how best to use new technologies and integrate them into tactics, doctrine, force structure. And the approach that they took, I think, was creative and effective. The idea was, we can't do this in a centralized way. Things are moving too fast. Also, we don't want to restrict the initiative of subordinates, lower level officers. We want to encourage the inventiveness and creativity of the more junior officers in the Navy. And so we're going to let them experiment, and we're going to let them try these things out and see what works and see what doesn't. And we're going to couple that to an assessment mechanism, right? So it's not just experimentation for experimentation's sake. I mean, that can be valuable to a certain extent, but if you don't have a way to assess and evaluate and then capture lessons, it's for naught, right? The lesson will be embedded in the heads of that officer or that ship's crew, and then when they leave or they rotate to go somewhere else, it's gone. So you got to find a way to build off of it, to capture it and capitalize on it. And the Navy was good at doing that. It was systemic about it. It wasn't just a few people. It was a pattern. And I think today we need to do the same kinds of things with AI, with software, with uncrewed systems.
Yeah.
Same sort of stuff. Because I mean, just look at what we can see. We a lot of us see it in social media and on the internet. Look at what the Ukrainians are doing with drones.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah. And, I've seen stuff on there where I've been like, I wish I'd thought of that. That's really
clever. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. So you said a key word in there. You said the Navy, at one point, we were really good at innovation. What happened? And can you tell us, I believe naval officers still engage with you, asking you, what do we do right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, let me go back a little bit before I answer that question, because
sure.
I think it's valuable to say, like, there are time periods where the technology is changing rapidly. We can see that in history. One time period is the one you alluded to, like the 20s, 30s, 40s. Radar is new toward the tail end of that time frame, but aircraft are relatively new throughout that. And that was the basis of experimentation. Also, increasingly effective fire control systems over the course of that time as well, which is something that I think aren't as visible to people just because, they're not as visible. They don't see them. But earlier, at the dawn of the 20th century, you've got a lot of new technologies too. You got new platforms, like the destroyer was a new platform. It's got these torpedoes on it. It's high speed. It can travel across the oceans. How do we use it? How do we coordinate groups of destroyers together? Submarine was new in that time. How do we use those? So prior to World War I, the Navy was doing this in a less systemic way. It was experimenting. It was exploring. A lot of it was individually driven. And then it became harnessed in a more systemic approach after World War I, early 1920s. And then what happens is the Navy has this learning system, this learning mechanism, and World War II happens. And it's used advantageously over the course of the conflict, but also the Navy's growing at an extremely rapid rate. And there's not the same degree of patience. Allowing officers to experiment pre-war is one thing, right? It's peacetime. The consequences of a failed experiment are, well, maybe you don't advance as far, or maybe you have to retire a little bit earlier. But the institution, the Navy, unlikely that anybody dies. World War II, you're learning via combat. And so if people are applying the wrong lessons or experimenting too much, there's too much variability, that can be really disadvantageous. And so there is a move to, once effective patterns are figured out for the technologies that exist at the time, to make things more centralized. You can really see this with the increasing standardization of training regimes as new ships enter the fleet. Early on, say 1940, there's a lot of flexibility. The captain, the executive officer, and other senior members of the ship, they'll get together and figure out, how are we going to arrange things? What's the damage control drill like? They have a lot of flexibility by the time you get to, say, 1944. And we can see this from not just the procedures that were introduced, but also from surviving records. There are training commands that say, this is how you do it. This is how you set up your CIC. This is the layout you want. This is, how you organize your damage control bill for a ship of this type. We'll give it to you. Yeah, you've got to, tweak it and modify it maybe a little bit for specifics of your situation, but there's a lot less flexibility. So that happened. Officers who were part of the community during the World War II timeframe, some of them still had this creative energy and this willingness to experiment in a more systematic way. The Navy does some very good things in the immediate post-war period, but it begins to taper off because there's been this increasing level of standardization imposed more centrally and less exploration allowed at the edges. Now, we've covered a lot in your first two questions, man.
No. You get so we get more standardization. I'm kind of curious. When you get into more standardization, does that mean so we're moving from exploration to exploitation in a sense?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Is that stifle innovation? Is that what you're getting at, or some thoughts on that?
I think stifling is probably the wrong word. That sounds too heavy. That sounds like, we're not innovating at all. I think instead the process becomes different. The process of innovation becomes more centralized and less experimental in terms of distributed experimentation. Because what you see in the 20s and 30s is a lot of parallel experimentation. After World War II, the Navy is still innovating, still embracing new technologies, still understands it has to be a very technology-heavy institution. But it's more centralized. It's more managed from the top down.
Okay, we'll stay on the topic of the Navy for a little bit. That's my background, and that's what your books are about, basically. When we look at where the Navy is today as compared to 80, 90 years ago, it's been that long.
It's been a long time.
What are our leaders getting wrong today? And maybe you can apply that to organizations as well.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to speculate on what they're doing wrong today, just because, there's what I can see that is publicly available, right? And that's one face, that's one view. And then there's, what are they doing in more classified forums? What steps are they taking in other areas? And so, I have a blinkered view, and I think everybody needs to, accept that caveat. One of the things that I am concerned about is whether or not the kinds of learning and innovation that they're trying to encourage, because they are trying to encourage it, is systemic enough. So I talked earlier that there was a system that the Navy had in the 20s and 30s, right? So it's not just we're going to allow people to experiment, we're going to evaluate those, and then we're going to have an improvement mechanism that assesses these experiments and figures out what new ideas should get folded into tactics and doctrine. And I think now they try that, but it's not quite as systemic, right? There have been attempts to recreate the fleet problems. The fleet problems were these large contested exercises from the 20s and 30s, very open-ended. They still happen, but they don't happen in a way, or they were for a while, but they don't happen in a way that I think is as systemic, where you're, feeding the lessons from one into the next one. You're using that to update procedures, tactics, doctrine, and the like. It seems a little bit more scripted. It seems a little bit more constrained. I could be wrong about that. Again, this is what I feel like I see, or this is what I see from the outside. So there may be more details on the inside. But
so I want some clarification on this. Experimentation you brought up in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It's kind of distributed. It's I would say it's isolated, but today when we're coaching organizations, we're asking them to experiment in a distributed nature. What is that team going to do? Don't tell them what they're going to do. Have them tell us what they're going to experiment on. Is that the type of context or atmosphere you're trying to create today, or you want to try to create? Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. I think if I'm reading you right, yes. So another example of today, like there's been a lot of experimentation with uncrewed systems, which I think is great. But I think a lot of it has been focused and centralized on, if I remember the number right, Task Force 59, right? So they're doing a lot of that work. Uh, well, that's, in sort of CENTCOM, where things are of a certain condition and the
Right.
environment is of a certain way. What about like the far north? What about in
Yeah.
the Pacific? What about the littorals around the Philippines and some of the other islands? Might uncrewed systems operate a little bit differently in those environments? Might we want to use different uncrewed systems in those environments? How do we figure that out? How could we make that experimentation more broad base so that lessons that are contextual, but also lessons, a broader set of lessons start to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back more specifically to your question, yeah, I think this experimentation can be driven well if we think of it as akin to mission command, right? If you're going to do mission command, you give an objective. You don't tell the subordinate unit how to achieve that objective. You leave that up to them. You try
Right.
to empower and trigger their creativity. I think it's the same kind of thing when we're talking about this sort of experimentation. You put a goal out there or an objective, and you see how they can meet it.
What kind of tools do you need to provide those folks that are out there at the front end, or the tip of the spear, uh, in the context? What do they need to have? And I'm going to be a little bit more specific here in a second. We have David Marquet writing about turning the ship around. Dunbar number within a submarine mission command, able to do things that he needs to get done there. Highly trained personnel, submariners happen to be well trained, doctrine, process driven. They can get some amazing things done. Not everybody is trained like that, right? So when you think about an organization, taking what Dave Marquet did, Captain Marquet did, and applying it to an organization, you're forgetting about one important thing, and that's the interactions of the people that you're working with. Do they know how to work together as teams? And I'll make that argument every single day that that's one of the advantages he has that organizations don't have. So kind of leading you in this direction. Tell me, what do we need in your mind and from your research? What do leaders need to provide to their people to help them innovate in this novel space?
Yeah, and thanks for the additional detail, because I think a team or an understanding of how and when to collaborate is very important to that. One of the things that I've noticed that is really important is being clear about sort of the lines of effort, which isn't exactly lines of authority, but it may overlap with that, right? Mm-hmm. So in some ways, military establishments may have this a little bit easier because they're usually pretty clear on that. But a lot of times it can also get muddied, right? You can have dual-headed individuals. You can have sort of confused lines of authority. But that's one thing that I think is really important. Because you can't just say, if you're going to use this mission command approach or establish an objective and then empower people to go meet it, you can't be confused about, well, whose objective is that? And you also can introduce a lot of problems if you say, okay, well, your objective team, team one, your objective is half of that. Team two, your objective is, the second third of that. And team three, you have something else to do to make it work. Right. So that group, that team, or whoever the organization is that you're empowering needs to have a line of sight to the objective. They need to feel like they can get to it. And if they don't, if that's obscured, a lot of this won't happen because they'll take it as far as they can. They'll take it up to the organizational or the authority boundary, and then that's it. They won't achieve the objective. And so to me, I think that's one of the most important things to do is to figure out, like, what do we want to achieve? And are we organized right to achieve it? And are we organized right to experiment while achieving it? And if those things aren't the case, then this becomes really, really difficult. It can get mired in like organizational. Well, these are the negatives when we talk about organizational bureaucracy, right? Because you're trying to cross these lines of authority and reporting, and it just becomes a morass.
It's great insights. And then going back to the lessons from World War II and the 1930s, did you identify anything within the team dynamics? You had these sailors that are coming from all parts of the world, diverse, cognitively diverse kids that are operating these machines that are brand new, right, or new then. What else was required to enable that novelty back then?
Yeah, there are a couple of important ingredients that they have that I think are really key. One, the officer corps is relatively small. I mean, we're still talking about the Navy,
Yeah.
same organization, same institution, but it's smaller than, right? And most of them, if not all of them, have gone through Annapolis. And so they have some shared context and shared history, and they can rely on that. They've seen each other before. So there's a familiarity that exists. That's really important. Another thing that's important about that is the organizational silos in the Navy at that time were a bit more fluid than they are now, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're an aviator. That's what you are.
Yeah. Brown shoe. Yeah.
Exactly. You're a brown shoe. You're not a SWO. You're not a black shoe. You're not a bubblehead, and you were proud of that fact. Right. But some of these officers back then could skirt between these communities. You see some who have been dual qualified. And so there's greater ability to transfer from one to the other. And they see themselves, a lot of them, as naval officers first, who have expertise in one or more of these areas. But there's a different identity than what the service has encouraged today. Today is not necessarily a problem. It's just different, right? So that's an important context too, because they're thinking sort of whole Navy, holistically. The other thing that I think is important, particularly as we get into the 1930s, is the Navy can be very choosy about enlisted sailors. Who's coming into the Navy? Well, there's a depression. So lots of people are looking for jobs, and we're picking the people who we think have the best aptitude. So you get a lot of sailors who are good with mechanical implements. They've worked on a farm and tweaked their tractor, so they know how to relate to machinery, a lot of them. And that means that they can do some of this experimentation, especially if it's like, reconfiguring wiring or adjusting details of the machinery on the ship to, maybe tweak some more efficiency out of the engineering plant. They're comfortable with those things, and they can do that. So a lot of there's ingredients.
So the ingredients that we've talked about are actually group triggers to flow. So flow is really about innovation, novelty. Let me just cover some of these real fast and see if they resonate with you. Shared goals. We've talked about that. We didn't talk about blending egos, but that's really about creating psychological safety, removing rank, flattening the organization the best you can. Equal participation, a little bit that was covered in the last minute. Familiarity, you clearly articulated that. Open communication, close listening, and of course, the external environment, shared risk and high consequences. So right there, those are triggers that we need to actually achieve flow and achieve any type of novelty. It wasn't planned that you were going to talk about that, but I want to thank you for that. It's just really cool to see how these things overlap. That there are many ways to explain what happened in the past, but at the end of the day, that's where we find some coherence in all this. Everything seems to be merging towards something that makes sense for organizations. So, hey, I want to introduce you to Mark McGrath. Moose is here. Moose is a Marine. Big brain up in New York. Like you to meet Trent Hone. So Mark's just joining us a few minutes late.
Yeah, I was struck. I'm very familiar with your work, and I wanted to tag on to what Ponch was saying. If we go back to World War II, one of the books that I recommend a lot is Unrestricted Warfare by James DeRose, and it talks about that cadre of officers that basically had to rebrand submarines. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, because, while there were the majority of officers that did go to Annapolis, and they had those bonds between, what company they were in or what sport they played or whatever, there still kind of was an old guard of tech and engineering, and they needed pirates, they needed buccaneers, and that's who Mush Morton and Richard O'Kane. And then, by the way, I think Richard O'Kane crossed over from surface to subs too. That kind of innovation seemed to turn the tide with guys like Flucky and others. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on those.
Oh yeah, the submarine story is, I think, a good example of how, if the feedback loops aren't right, some of this innovative process doesn't work. So let's sort of go back to one of the fundamental organizing principles, right? The unrestricted submarine warfare is illegal for most of the interwar period. And you can't do it. You're not going to be able to sink merchant ships without warning. That's just not acceptable. The Germans did that in World War I. We don't want to do that either. But what's fascinating in some of the documentation from the U.S. Navy is that you get sub-officers talking about Japan is an island nation. Japan has lots of commerce, and Japan could be really vulnerable to an unrestricted submarine campaign. And then very quickly they'll say, but that's illegal, so we can't talk about that. And so it's almost like there's this wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing going on. And but the problem is, because that sort of fight is considered to be illegal, what the subs do in the interwar period is they train to attack a naval formation that is generally very well screened and protected. And you can see records of this in the fleet problems. They don't do it at night. They do it during the day. At night, it's considered to be too dangerous. And during the day, they're forced to make submerged attacks and submerged approaches. They're trying to hide from anti-submarine patrols, not just surface ships, but also aircraft that are trying to find them. And so they're driven to these conservative tactics that, you know, are going to be horrible when it comes to trying to attack a convoy or an independent merchant ship. And so they have to unlearn that. But it's, you know, it's these artificialities of the feedback loop. You know, we're doing these exercises rather than engaging how we actually think we might fight, that drive that kind of behavior. So this is, if we're going to have feedback loops, if we're going to try to foster innovation, I think you have to be very clear about, you know, where are we going and what are the future conditions likely to be like, and how do we evaluate success? And the Navy's subforce doesn't do that well in the interwar period, but because of this backdrop, this illegality. And they have to pivot right away. And what I think is fascinating is how quick the Navy says, all right, we're going to introduce unrestricted warfare, right? It's like hours after Pearl Harbor, you know, so the plans are there. So somebody should have acknowledged, like, this is how we're going to fight. So this is how we should prepare.
What's interesting about those guys too is, and I can't not recommend this book enough, because I'm biased. I'm a Marine that served in the Pacific, you know, many years later on a lot of these islands that were taken. And of course I have a deep love for that. And the submarine story continues to always be one of my favorites because of this sort of radical approach that these guys took and the great risks that they took. And I want to get your sense of, like, the institutional risk that was allowed, because Mush Morton innovated and lost his life. Dick O'Kane, who got the Medal of Honor, was taken prisoner because his sub was sunk, because these guys were so successful taking considerable risk. It was a high risk, high reward type scenario. What were some of the institutional views that, I mean, they let these guys kind of go off the chain, so to speak, but I'm sure that there had to be a take somewhere, like an official take on the level of risk that these guys were taking. Because I guess when we think of the fleet that, you know, we were in in my time and in Ponch's time, you know, it's the opposite. It was like completely risk averse.
Oh yeah. Well, I think if you want to think about it institutionally, a lot of this gets into Admiral Nimitz's approach, you know, Commander in Chief of the Pacific Fleet, also of the Pacific Ocean Area's theater, because a lot of these submarines roll up to him. And one of the things that he did very quickly upon assuming command is reorganize the fleet, and he breaks the submarines out. Previously, the submarines, if I remember right, were part of the scouting force, and he takes the submarines and makes them report directly to him. Now, he's a former submarine officer, so he has some familiarity with them, but I think part of that was also driven by the fact that he wanted to keep a close touch on it, and he spends a lot of time one-on-one with his sub commander, eventually, you know, Lockwood, who is in charge of them later in the war. And that's so that Nimitz can keep an eye on this. You know, he liked to get close to the things that he felt were important and going to be decisive. And it's clear that he recognizes that submarines are going to be that way. So he stays close to them, and he tries to, you know, there's the whole, we haven't gotten into the whole story about the torpedoes yet, but, you know, for listeners who may not be aware, initially U.S. submarine torpedoes are disastrous. They don't work very well. And numerous iterations have to be gone through to fix the problems with them. Nimitz stays close to that and acts as a voice toward the Bureau of Ordnance, which is responsible for producing those torpedoes, to say, look, this is what the captains are seeing in the field. They're not performing, and this is why they're not performing. And so he's saying that to the Bureau of Ordnance, and then he's telling the sub captains, look, you can disable the defective magnetic exploders. Just revert to contact exploders because we think those will work better, even though meanwhile, the Bureau of Ordnance will try to work things out. So he's part of the mix there. If we think about it from like an institutional standpoint, that is saying, yeah, we want to take risks. Yes, we want to be aggressive. We want to have success with this. And I think you can see, I mean, I spend time in my Nimitz book talking about his aggressiveness, his sort of view of risk. It's very much we shouldn't view risk negatively. We should view risk as opportunity. We're going to take risks. The enemy's going to take risks. We should take better risks or earlier risks, or however you want to define that, to gain advantage. Because if you don't, if you're not at that edge, you won't get the advantage.
It's kind of tying it back to another thing when you mentioned Lockwood and Nimitz in the same realm. And then I think of Spruance and Richmond Kelly Turner, kind of going back to how we're talking about officers with deep relationships and collaborative relationships. It should be noted that these four guys are all buried next to each other together.
Yep.
At Golden Gate National Cemetery. I mean, what kind of a bond organizationally do you have to have, from a leadership standpoint, from a leadership quality standpoint, to achieve what they were able to achieve, which, anybody can go on Google Earth and look at the Pacific Ocean covers, 25% of the world, right? I mean, that kind of camaraderie, that kind of connection, can that be replicated in other organizations such that, maybe not the extreme of all four being buried next to each other in a living agreement, but what kind of bonds do you think are possible in organizations today?
Yeah, I think Ponch, this gets back to your point about flow and about some of this, tacit understanding that you need to accumulate. One of the arguments that I make in Mastering the Art of Command is that the early stages of the Central Pacific Offensive, which kicks off in November 1943, it's led by Admiral Spruance, who you mentioned. One of the reasons that flows so smoothly for the next couple months up until, June of 1944 is because Admiral Spruance and Admiral Nimitz have spent a lot of time together, getting very familiar with each other, understanding the context of this offensive and how they're going to have to operate. Spruance, listeners may know, was commanding one of the task forces at the Battle of Midway. After that, he comes ashore and serves as Nimitz's chief of staff. So the two of them are together on a daily basis, even more frequently than that, because they're rooming in the same house. And so they go on walks together, they exercise together, they're, going through plans together, they're in all the same meetings every day. And through all of that, there becomes this mutual understanding of, how do we need to act? What kinds of decisions should we make under certain circumstances? And I like to liken it to a sports team, because this is something that I can draw on from my own experience. I was on some teams where we got very good at understanding each other. You practice a lot together. You begin to understand the habits, the moves of your teammates, and you can anticipate what they're going to do. Like there's an emerging situation on the field and you're like, Joe's going to cut to the right. I know he's going that way. And so, you kick the ball over there and he turns and the ball's on its way and he gets it right. That's the kind of thing that you learn to anticipate. So you don't have to communicate everything. It smooths flow. It makes these things easier. And so that's one example. I think Turner is different. He's buried with those guys and he works with all those guys, but he's a bit of a harder edge.
He had to deal with Marines.
Yeah. Yes, he did.
And they didn't all go to Annapolis.
No. But yeah, Lockwood, Spruance, and Nimitz all seem to have I don't want to say a similar disposition, because there's obviously Nimitz is more aggressive than Spruance. That's not something that I think comes through a lot of the secondary literature, but it's true if you look at how they're interacting. Nimitz is more of a pusher than Spruance is. But they get along really well.
How much of that transcended down to like the wardroom level? How tight were wardrooms back then relative to today? Now I get it, there was a war going on and it was an existential war for the United States. But when you assess like wardroom culture, what do you think are the major differences between then and now?
That's a great question, because one of the things that doesn't survive in a lot of the records, I mean, you can get it in like oral histories and things, but those are, the experience of one individual, a point in time. And it's hard, therefore, to relate that to today. The one the exception that I have for that actually gets back to Nimitz, because he was the commanding officer of cruiser Augusta when it was the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. And he was very deliberate about using the wardroom as educational opportunity. So, it's Augusta is there sailing around in the Philippines and China, and he would bring officials, dignitaries, and other people on board to talk to the wardroom. Right. So we're going to have the ambassador from from Great Britain here to talk to the wardroom, give them information about, the situation here, their perspective, et cetera. We're going to have a representative from the U.S. State Department. We're going to have, an officer from the British Asiatic Fleet to come and talk to us about what's going on. And all to try to give those officers more context about the environment that they were in there in Asia, the U.S. place in it. And so that they could think not just about, what are we doing now on the ship? What do we have to do tomorrow? But like, how does the United States fit into the world situation? And I thought that was really interesting. There were a number of officers who were part of that group that commented on that.
So like a wardroom was like a PME venue.
Yeah.
And at the same time, double hatting is, PME, but also like Einheit, like mutual trust tightening, like tightening the trust amongst the officers and camaraderie.
Now, not everybody goes to be, sync pack. So this may be very exceptional. Nimitz's environment may not have been typical. So I don't want to say that like, all the ships of the fleet were doing that. I think that would be erroneous, but there is an example. And I think, I haven't been in many wardrooms lately, but I do think that there are ships that try to do something similar, or at least pockets of officers who are trying to like upskill everybody around them, whatever way they can.
I would tell you that. So as a Marine, I spent time on LSDs, and we would eat, as officers, we'd eat in the wardroom. And out in the fleet, those wardrooms for us anyway, were all kind of eat as you go, come in and out. But I was on a destroyer as a midshipman, and that destroyer had, with the exception of officers that were on watch or whatever, they had sit down times for meals, and they sat down, and I think it was dinner was, if I remember correctly, breakfast and lunch are kind of as you go, but underway, dinner was something that we all sat down together as, and it was a totally different climate. Now, granted, a Spruance class was a little smaller, a tighter wardroom than an LSD, which also adds the compounding of all these extra Marine officers that you don't have. But it was kind of a noticeable trait anyway. But I will tell you this from a ground standpoint. In Australia, the Royal Australian Army, they had an officers' mess where they did all dine together. And in those dining sessions, they're talking, and so that was a different cultural experience, because that doesn't exist in the fleet anymore, not in the Marine Corps like it did. So to my knowledge.
I think that's underestimated. I mean, you could say, oh, we're just all getting together to have dinner together, but I mean, people can probably relate from their family experiences, right? Like if you make it a set thing to everybody in the family comes and sits down at dinner, like that's different than if you just sort of like, come as you go, or grab whatever food as you go and buy.
Well, you can't bring your iPhone to dinner now, right? That's important. You don't want to.
well, right. I mean, I'm talking about not having your phone there, sitting down, talking, and it doesn't
interacting with other people, having a conversation, things that are not happening like they used to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think it much matters what you're talking about, as long as you're talking. All right. Because you will gravitate to the things that are, important or of interest. And I think invariably some of that stuff on a destroyer is going to be like, well, how are we going to work together? Or what's the new exercise coming up? How are we going to approach that? Or we have an inspection. How are we going to make sure everything is ship shape for the pun?
When you think about guys like Nimitz and Spruance, I mean, these were men of like high character, impeccable leadership. But one thing that's unique about both of them, they never wrote an autobiography or a memoir. And there's like a lot of murk, what were the sources, the firsthand sources that you really would get? Was it dispatches or was it journals that you could, or did they keep diaries? Because to my knowledge, none of those have been published. They must be in archives.
There are a whole series of letters that Nimitz wrote back home,
Uh-huh.
and an anthology of them was just released by the Naval History and Heritage Command. And what's unfortunate about them is some of the ones from the most tense period, like the latter half of 1942, basically is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Deliberately, I forget whether they were burned or somehow otherwise destroyed by his wife. So that because one of the things that Nimitz was really conscious of is what goes back to psychological safety, something that you mentioned, Punch. We want to have an environment where you can air it out, like behind closed doors, but then in the public face, we're going to be unified. We're not going to present the dirty laundry or our disagreements to the press or to other things, because he was really affected by some incidents that he saw as a young officer, where those controversies in the U.S. Navy after the Spanish-American War did get aired. And it's like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to be part of that. So those were useful, though, but they're letters to his wife, and she tried to eliminate anything that was controversial. Some things that were really valuable is the National Archives has preserved most of the plans and orders, so you can get a sense of how they were framing operations. And sometimes those were plans that were written but not issued, so you can see how they would iterate over time and refine a plan. There are joint staff studies, which are prior to a plan for an operation. What are we going to need to do? So sort of like the forward-looking conceptualization. There is something called the Gray Book, which is a running estimate that Nimitz and his staff maintained through the course of the war. And that has dispatches back and forth, so messages. It's not all the messages, but it's a select set. And then along with it, just a daily summary, like what happened today. Some of those summaries are pretty lengthy. Oops, if there's a lot going on, but some are a lot more brief. So that was really useful, because it's like this is the run of the war. What else? I spent a lot of time looking at, action reports, what really happened, or at least as best as the people who are writing it up after the fact could tell. And let's see, what are some of the other?
It seems like Spruance is so underrated as a naval commander, and almost he's an afterthought. Now the class of ships doesn't exist anymore, so people hardly ever talk about him. Yeah.
I he doesn't get that fifth star, which is I don't think entirely fair given the level of his contribution compared to some of the others who achieved that rank. And and he's very modest, right? Like you say, it doesn't write an autobiography, doesn't write a memoir. It goes back to the Naval War College, is happy being its president. That's what he was content to do. Yeah. But really, very, very solid. Absolutely.
So we talk a lot about asymmetry and nonlinearity and applying, asymmetric guerrilla tactics. And I was listening to a brief by recently deceased General Alfred Gray, who's the one who brought John Boyd into the Marine Corps and was instrumental behind that. And in one of these lectures, the lecture maybe was about 10 years ago, plus or minus, and he talked about former Commandant Robert Barrow. And he said when General Barrow was fighting in World War II, he was fighting in the guerrilla operations in China, which I had never heard of. So I looked it up, and I find this whole thing, and it's called like the Sino-American Cooperative Organization, I think was what it was called. And it was led by an admiral named Milton Miles, who wrote a book called A Different Kind of War. And it's another part of the war that nobody ever talks about. Yet with everything going on with China today, it's actually something that people should take a look at. What are your thoughts on that end of the Pacific War that nobody ever talks about? The Rice Paddy Navy is the sort of the nickname.
And they had a pennant too. What was like the what the heck pennant or something like that. Or anyway, there's a particular flag associated with that organization. I think that's really important to look at, not just for the reasons that you say, but because there was an assumption the Navy's leadership, so Admiral Nimitz, but then also Admiral Ernest King, who's the commander-in-chief in Washington, felt that to defeat Japan, they were likely going to have to use the soldiers from China, right? I think the pre-war concept is largely it's going to be a war, Japan versus the United States, one-on-one, and in that construct, we can blockade Japan and force them to surrender through threat of starvation and starving off their commerce. But with all the additional players in the conflict, I think they felt that it was likely that they would have to defeat or isolate the Japanese army on the Asian mainland. And that's going to require China to be a key player. And so one of the things that I think is valuable, but that doesn't get a sufficient amount of attention. And in the book that I'm working on now, which is going to be a study of Admiral King, I'm looking at some of that. There's a lot of drive to reopen the Burma Road, so that there would be an overland route to resupply China from, Burma or from Eastern India. And they can't, the combined chiefs of staff, the U.S. Joint Chiefs and the British chiefs, disagree on the feasibility of such an operation or when to mount it. And so what the Navy turns to is, well, we've got to seize Taiwan, or, then it was called Formosa, or a base on mainland China. And that's Operation Causeway. It is never mounted because Luzon is seized instead. And there's not enough equipment to make the operation worthwhile. But this idea that there's got to be these guerrilla operations to sort of make China ready, or get things disrupted enough in terms of the Japanese capability that a landing could succeed. And then there was an anticipation that they would move up the coast of China, not unlike General MacArthur moved up the coast of New Guinea. That is, naval power would allow a sort of a mobility that Japanese forces within on the land couldn't match. And so their concentrations could be isolated, cut off from ports, and slowly defeated and or starved. And then that would allow an opportunity not just to defeat the Japanese army, but then, bring Japan and its home islands to its knees. Now, obviously, the war unfolds very differently than that. But this is a concept that they had. And I think if we step back from that, we could look at this as a way in which the United States military leadership is entertaining options. Right. So one way to defeat Japan is to defeat their army on the mainland. Another way to defeat Japan is, well, leave that alone and we'll isolate the home islands and drop atomic bombs and convince the Soviet Union to get into the war. So there are different victory mechanisms that are being maintained and explored through the war. And I think that's a really valuable way to think about it, because I wouldn't call it asymmetric necessarily, but you can keep those alive through asymmetric mechanisms like the unit that you mentioned, the guerrilla forces in China.
It's a great recap or synopsis of the importance of optionality in anything you do, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of organizations don't understand that. They get so fixated on one desired path that they actually end up failing as a result.
And the history in some ways makes it difficult, because we know what happened. And so one of the things that I will sometimes have challenges with, because I know a lot of these details, I'll read something and be like, because it just assumes there was this linearity, that was the one way to go. And if you look at what some of these people were actually dealing with, some of these military officers, they're thinking about all these different pathways and then picking the ones that are most fruitful at the time.
Yeah. Well, they also don't understand the structure of complexity. They'll pin everything on, well, Nimitz did this or MacArthur did that, and it doesn't account for the complexity of massive organizations. And I'll run this one by. I mean, I think that we as naval people have an edge over military thinkers that are not naval, because whether you're crashing doing a controlled crash onto a ship, or you're getting marine artillery ashore, you have to factor in the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity of the ocean. It never. It's always part of our decision making, that our Air Force brethren that are landing on 5 miles of tarmac, or
next to a Hilton.
Yeah, right. Yeah, or army guys that live in brick buildings. That they don't have to factor in the sea. And I always feel like the sea is really, when you think of guys like Nimitz, and you think of Spruance and even the Richmond Kelly Turner, and then all the Marine commanders, they had a deep respect and understanding especially the guys that were coming from the Naval Academy, right? Because they could all do celestial navigation. They could all do things that, they had a deep understanding of that constant presence of the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity of the sea. And I feel like that's a massive advantage for naval thinkers, but that's my bias.
Well, Trent doesn't know anything about complexity, so
nothing.
No, Trent's pretty sharp on complexity. So
I just wanted to point that out, though, because I think that is a physical. I think it's the most present physical factor on the globe is the ocean, and then when you think of the Pacific, when you think of that being a quarter of the world, the calculation and the thought process behind all of that unpredictable constant movement. I think it gives us an advantage in some respects, but that again, that's my bias.
I think it does, and I think in some ways it might have been more visible at that time, 80 years ago, when some of these events were happening, because I can see it. Like the U.S. Army officers in the Pacific or elsewhere, they're much more linear in terms of their thought. They're not as it's not as option based. Their approach to planning, their approach to executing these operations, and the Marines and the naval officers seem to be a lot more opportunistic. Now this is not true in all cases, of course, but just as a general theme. I've noted that in like some of the early MacArthur campaign plans, they're very linear. This is General MacArthur in the Southwest.
Do you think he adapted?
Area. He did. Yeah, he did. But it takes Nimitz pulling him along, because one of the MacArthur's ego is extremely potent, right? And he couldn't stand to think that his place in the sun was going to get eclipsed. Nimitz started to advance so rapidly across the Central Pacific. He was like, "Oh gosh, I've got to make it across New Guinea faster and get back to the Philippines. Otherwise, I might not have a major role in the war." And it works out for him that around, while he's feeling that pressure, the Australians, one of the divisions in his command, finds a Japanese Army code book. They'd tried to destroy it by burying it in a river. It didn't work. It was too wet to turn it on, to light it on fire. So that gets recovered, dried out. And then all of a sudden, MacArthur has insight into the Japanese Army's dispositions, in the area that he's going to be moving into. And so he can attack where they're weak and move much more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Navy got him out of Corregidor. The Navy got him ashore in Leyte. The Navy got him in Incheon. I mean, I think he finally woke up to the reality that, hey, maybe these naval guys are onto something.
Yeah, I think he did. Although he went through a lot of naval commanders before he could get there.
Yeah, but it's interesting about his brother. I learned this later, but his brother was an Annapolis grad. And his brother was a captain that he died of appendicitis. And his belief was that if my brother lived, it was Arthur MacArthur, the whatever number, because they were all Arthur MacArthurs. Yeah. He said, had my brother not died of appendicitis, he would have been the one with the 5th star. But yeah, he was a naval commander. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
we have the MacArthur Center here. I've only been there once.
It's phenomenal.
It's pretty amazing here in Norfolk, Virginia.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I think he gets. Do you think? I ask you this, Trent. Do you think that MacArthur? Because I'm pretty strongly. My upbringing until I decided to go the naval route. My father's a retired West Pointer, and MacArthur and Duty on Our Country speech and all that was a big part of being his kid. But I've always thought that he gets an unfair shake, that he's reduced to like this tyrant that wanted to nuke the Chinese. And when you start to dig in, now I agree with you, he had a huge ego. He was extremely arrogant. But at the same time, I really did think that at some level he actually did get it. Because as you say, I mean, he learned, he was able to flexibly adapt and understand that maybe these naval guys were onto something. But I think that over time he was able to adapt his mindset, and a lot of his opposition were not.
Yeah, he is able to adapt. I do think he deserves a lot of credit for the successes that occur in his area in World War II. I'm less conversant with his time in Korea, but he does adapt. He does learn. I do think that his approach to organizing his command is very, very traditional Army, and therefore very different from Nimitz. So one of the lenses with which I come at it is, to put a modern spin on it, Nimitz's leadership not just in terms of personal leadership, but how he's going to organize, feels more, or is more, I would say, complexity informed compared to MacArthur. So one specific example, Nimitz takes a very sort of navalist point of view. We're going to organize cross-functional task forces to accomplish certain things, right? And we're going to install a commander of the task force. It doesn't matter what service they are, but they're going to be able to, command all the units that are assigned to that, regardless of whether they're part of the Army or the Army Air Force and the Marines or the Navy or whatever, right? So Spruance's Fifth Fleet is that way. The Central Pacific Force is that way. MacArthur takes jointness up to his general headquarters level, right? So he's got, an Army Air Commander, he's got an Army Land Commander, he's got a Naval Commander. And so jointness is sort of something that he manages rather than delegating. And I think that creates a little bit less flexibility, a little bit less optionality. It works out okay. I mean, his command does well. He chooses subordinates who work effectively with him. But I don't think it's stressed in some of the ways that Nimitz's command was, particularly early in the war.
We had one of our earliest guests was Charlie Protzman, and he came to tell us the story about when MacArthur was the regent of Japan for 6 years before the Korean conflict started, that he brought in all of these, speaking, I guess, to his adaptability and his ability to reorient, of fusing Eastern thinking with Western business practices to sort of create the Japanese miracle that creates the Toyota production system and everything. He was pretty prescient in a lot of things that he doesn't get credit for. But
yeah, I mean, well, like anybody, he's a complex figure. You try to reduce him to just an ego or just a warmonger, and that's a disservice. It doesn't give you everything.
Yeah, I think that's our predisposition as Americans, right? We like to pin something on a person, right? Blame somebody. One of my greatest, I'd love to get your take on this, because I think that your work has added a lot of stuff that these miss, like, the Samuel Eliot Morrison volume set, the 15 volume. I mean, it's one of my prized possessions. And you can read it now and it's very readable. It's quick, but it's also too, you can see what's left out. I mean, you can see that there's a lot of the complexity stuff. But what, with your book on Nimitz, what do you think are the biggest, sort of, vitamins and, kind of additions to the the Potter book, because the Potter book was the definitive Nimitz book, because Nimitz never wrote an autobiography, never wrote a memoir. What do you think that you filled in that helps color the story of Nimitz? What's your biggest takeaway from that? Because the Potter book is so well known.
Yeah, I think the Potter book does a great job at describing Nimitz as a person and relating parts of his early career to his wartime leadership. And what I tried to do was focus more like, okay, let's just look at the war and let's look at how his headquarters organizes and how he commands. So not as much about personal relationships, more about organization, framing of plans, orders, conceptualizing that in order to execute. And that's something that Potter really doesn't spend much time on. I mean, he will talk about some of the hard conversations that Nimitz has to have before certain organization or operations, and that's valuable. But I'll add, like, here's the plan for the operation, and here's what it talked about, and here's how that related to other operations, and here's how all that was conceptualized in a planning framework, and how that got better over the course of the war. Like, Nimitz's staff structure and how it evolved, I think, is really fascinating and valuable for us now, because it gets into some of the things, Ponch, going back to your flow comment, though that organization was deliberately cross-functional and put the right kind of leadership in the right kinds of places. Like, one of the things that I make a point of is the head of the logistical division of that joint staff. He's an Army officer. And I kind of love how Nimitz played this, because so that Army officer, Brigadier General Levy, comes to the Pacific, tours the Pacific. He's a logistical expert, and he presents this list. Like, here's all the flaws. Here's all the things that you've got to do better, Nimitz. And Nimitz knew that he was going to be able to take that guy into his organization. And so he's like, that sounds great. We do need to fix all those things. And guess what, Levy? It's your job. Now you got to do it.
Do you? I gotta. This is kind of a theory. I'm a historian by undergrad, so as an amateur, I want to air this out with you. But I think it's also too about the cultural adaptability and flow and things. I think the other, I've posited or wondered about the other thing that the naval forces of the United States, so Navy and Marine Corps, have an advantage of is that we've been intervening in the Far East for hundreds, almost the entire history of our country. Do you think that we've gained? Because this is what I feel. I feel that we've pulled enough out of there just from exposure that we do have some intermingled Eastern thinking. Even a guy like MacArthur that spent his entire career in the Far East. Whereas on the other side, where everything's Western and very linear and very formulaic, that the culture of the naval forces has had a being so exposed to the East has been able to integrate some of that stuff into our thinking, even unwittingly, even like just by being exposed to it, or just over our orientation, just shaving, our orientation changing just by drift of being present there, versus sort of the European way of things that maybe others might be exposed to.
That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I mean, you certainly see evidence. There were, we called them China hands, right? So there were sailors, but also naval officers who were wanted to be part of the Asiatic fleet, got very comfortable with things there, and adapting to the lifestyle. Now that would be very different from, if any of the three of us went to live there today. I think, much older time period, different kinds of assumptions in terms of how someone from the United States would relate to people from that part of the world. But I do think that certainly among some individuals, and I'd be hesitant to extrapolate that too far, but yeah, there is a I don't know exactly what to call it, a receptivity or an expansion of the frame just because of what you're exposed to. Yeah.
Yeah. You think of like the big stations in Yokosuka, and you think of Subic Bay, and you think of Sasebo, but not even that. You can go back further. You go back to the Boxer Rebellion, and you go back even further. You go into the Korean intervention in the 1870s and other things.
Moose, I want to build on that. So, Trent, you met Sonia Blignot several years ago down in Quantico. I just had a conversation with her today. This connects back to navigation and the Polynesian navigation, wayfinding. Right, there are no maps. Yeah. So, have you looked into any of that yet, or see the connection? This connects back to what Mark's talking about.
So I used. I think it's Hutchins is the name of the author, Cognition in the Wild, which talks about that. It talks about different forms of navigation, compares what I'll call Western forms, which lead us to like latitude and longitude, with Polynesian or Micronesian forms. And the book is sort of an exploration of like, how do we make sense of things? Not just how do we navigate, but how do we conceptualize the world? And that was really useful because it gave me insights into how to think about or write about the Combat Information Center and its emergence. And I think that there's a lot of value in that wayfinding concept, because we see it. I've got another book on wayfinding that talks about it. It uses three different examples, if I remember right, but it talks about that navigation in the Pacific. It also talks about how Native American Eskimos will navigate in the far north. If you've got basically an ice sheet and the sun, how do you find your way? How do you find your way around? And there was a third example. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was interesting because I know what it was. It was in Australia. It was Aboriginal people in Australia, and how did they find their way? So you've got all these sort of different wayfinding type mechanisms that exist, and they're just all deeply contextual. Like if you look at how the Polynesians and the Micronesians would navigate, they're very sensitive to the waves. One of the books, I forget exactly which one it was, described how a navigator would like lay down on his or her back on the boat. And just by the way that the waves would move the boat, they would get a sense of where they might be. And yeah, I mean, you're shaking your head. I can't imagine that either, right? Like how would you know like what part of the sea you're in based on like how the boat moves your body? But like if you've done it enough,
I guess whales can do it.
Yeah. We can get very attuned to very subtle things if that's what your mind is conditioned to pay attention to. And
I have to ask you, why did you use the word attuned there? And the reason for is the conversation I had to get with Sonia again. And any reason behind that?
It seemed like the right word because I'm trying to think about like focus, sensitivity.
Okay.
But also like if I were going to try to do that, I would be using like 90% of my brain power to try to figure out the waves and such. And I don't think if you've been schooled in that tradition, you would do the same thing. I think it would be more, it wouldn't require the level of attention. And so that's part of also what I mean to attune. Like, you're trained, but you can pay attention to it in a way that is easy.
Requires less energy from the brain.
Yeah. Requires less energy from the brain. Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay. Wow. No, fascinating. And this is, again, not planned. This is something that Moose connected or triggered this thought because I just had the conversation with Sonia this morning about this very thing. And we actually got into sacred geometry and a bunch of other things, completely off topic today. But I know that you met Sonia, and I think the topic of navigating the Pacific is something that you may want to talk to her about. It's pretty cool. Amazing. Yeah. Hey, Trent, this has been fascinating. I know it's been 2019, November, I think, since we last connected. Don Vandergriff is there. It's been a while. And nothing's changed in the world, by the way. Right?
No, it's the same old world.
Same old stuff.
It's been amazing. So just want to kind of see what's going on in your world. You got a new book coming out potentially. You're doing a lot of work, even with our Navy still, right? I mean, you got Navy leaders that are calling you up. And saying,
I was down in Norfolk. What was that? March, I think. And I was in San Diego in October. So trying to help them understand some of the things they did well before, and maybe that can be a stepping stone to what they can do in the future.
Here's what you did. Here's what I learned from the Navy. Here's what you can learn from the Navy.
Well, I alluded before we kicked off. I alluded to this. So when I was in Norfolk is for this junior surface warfare officer symposium. So you have people there who'd been doing stuff in the Red Sea. So they've been at the sharp edge of things. But I wanted to give them some sense of what the Navy had done before. And then I assumed that they would probably all know about the fleet problems of the 20s and 30s. And so it was like, fleet problems, and just wanted to gauge the room. Like, okay, so raise your hand if you've heard of the fleet problems. Nobody's hand went up. So it's something that's been, it's too far back. It's lost in time. It's not a thing that they're concerned about. So there's value in the kinds of, that made me feel, well, first I was like, okay, now I have to explain them. I wasn't anticipating having to do that. But then second, there's value in the kind of perspective that I try to bring to them, because I think some of this just isn't understood or isn't being taught.
Wow.
Well, hey, I think we'll do a couple things here. Moose, do you have anything? Any parting thoughts?
I have something. I have something I want to ask Trent offline. The only other historical topic that I didn't check off my list was Kemp Tolley, the Cruise of the Lanikai, which was a Naval Institute book that I read, and it was basically like a sailboat dispatched. I think he had some kind of a murky background, like OSS or something, to basically sail around the Philippines and basically look for trouble in December of 1941. Cruise of the Lanikai.
Oh, yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, Kemp Tolley, he was an admiral. They have a bust of him at Annapolis. There's a bust. And I should qualify too. I was Naval ROTC, not an Annapolis grad, but I do know that there is a bust of him. And he got some award from Bill Clinton before Putin, Yeltsin, for his work. So again, draw your own conclusions. But like the book was The Cruise of the Lanikai, and it was a Naval Institute book that basically he led a crew around the Philippines to basically seek to engage the Japanese or something. That was the pre Pearl Harbor conspiracy, but the reality is what the stuff actually occurred, I think, after December 7th. So
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there was a strong guerrilla contingent in the Philippines, and I would not at all surprised that U.S. officers thought about that because they had to fight against Philippine guerrillas some 40 years before. So there was knowledge of how that kind of I'll call it an insurgency, could be maintained.
So, Trent, how can our listeners learn more about what you're doing? Do you have a website? What books should they be buying from you? Anything you
I
want
do.
to
I do have a website. I do a good job at keeping up to date with regard to the speaking events that I have, but I don't do a good job of posting on there. But I also try to put articles and things when they appear. So that's just my name with no spaces, trenthone.com. So that's one way to find them. My books are available through the Naval Institute. I publish through them. There's Learning War, which we've talked about, Mastering the Art of Command. There is a Fighting in the Dark, which was an anthology of, I was one of the editors, and I also have a chapter in there, but that's about the evolution of night combat from the perspective of different navies through the 20th century, like the Russian Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, even, and of course the U.S. Navy. Let's see. And yeah, there's another book coming out, but I don't owe that to the Naval Institute until January. So that's still in progress. Things are on track, but it will probably appear if things continue. Let's see, next year's 2026. So probably early 2027.
Learning War is my second favorite Naval Institute book.
Uh-oh. What's the first?
Hunt for Red October.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You can't go wrong with that. I love that book.
My dad had a first edition. And again, he's a West Pointer. He's like, here, you can have it. I have the original first edition, Hunt for Red October, Naval Institute Press.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And I've been a member since, again, ROTC days. But yeah, your work is phenomenal.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, Trent. Like I said,
Sure.
it's been too long, 6 years since we last connected in person.
Yeah, man.
The little COVID thing going on between then and now, but we're not too far from each other. We'll connect again, I'm sure. And you and I got to spend some time doing some complexity work with the U.S. Navy, 2020. I think it was 2019. I can't remember when that was last, but it's always a pleasure to work with you and hear from you. So thanks for being on the show. We'll get this out as soon as possible.
All right. Awesome.
Stay with us.